As the Trump administration continues to carry out its immigration crackdown, American farmers are facing a labor crisis.
Those Trump tariffs could have damaged agriculture substantially, not just exported grain and ethanol, but imported fertilizer as well.
The latest industry to take a supply chain hit, and that's farming. With a global fertilizer shortage, farmers across the world are having to shift tactics to make sure they have a good crop to harvest and sell.
But the shutdown also closed the agency that distributes that funding, as Trump is now teasing another kind of bailout.
A potential bumper crop of corn actually has corn growers a little bit worried this year. I'm Katrina Markle in Saunders County, where Dan Wesley, a veteran farmer, told me that his industry needs to find more markets for their products.
Trump is proposing what he calls severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizers. His idea here is apparently to support domestic production.
Something quiet but seismic is happening in the global grain market. Without headlines, without speeches, and without confrontation, Canada has made a strategic shift in how it moves grain across borders, and the fallout is already visible. U.S. exporters are being edged out of a market once considered secure not by sanctions, not by shortages, but by a recalculation of trust, pricing, and control. This isn't a trade dispute, it's a structural realignment. Tonight, we break down how a quiet Canadian grain move shut the U.S. out and why this shift signals a deeper change in global food power. For years, the global grain trade operated on assumptions that felt permanent. Certain exporters were seen as indispensable. Certain routes were considered default. Certain buyers were expected to return, year after year, out of habit as much as necessity. The United States benefited enormously from this inertia, its position in global grain markets, especially wheat, was built not only on scale, but on expectation. That expectation is now breaking. What makes the current moment so disruptive is not a sudden collapse or a visible crisis. There has been no embargo, no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation. Instead, access has quietly narrowed, contracts have shifted, shipping patterns have adjusted, and one major exporter, Canada, has moved in ways that subtly but decisively changed the balance. This is not a story about weather shocks or failed harvests. It is a story about trust, predictability, and strategic alignment. Grain is not just food, it is stability. For importing nations, especially those managing rapid population growth or fragile political environments, grain supply is existential. Bread prices affect public confidence. Supply disruptions can trigger unrest. Reliability matters more than ideology. In this context, procurement decisions are becoming increasingly conservative and strategic. Buyers are asking not just who can deliver today, but who can deliver under stress during currency volatility, shipping disruptions, or geopolitical tension. This is where old assumptions about U.S. dominance begin to falter. American grain exports are deeply integrated into a global financial system that is highly efficient but also highly exposed. Dollar pricing, insurance markets, shipping finance, and regulatory constraints all add layers of cost and risk that importers do not control. When interest rates rise, shipping premiums jump, or currency values swing, buyers pay the price even when the grain itself is plentiful. Over time, this volatility compounds. What once looked like reliability now looks like exposure. Canada's role in this shift is strategic, not aggressive. Rather than challenging U.S. exports head-on, it has leaned into consistency, stable logistics, predictable pricing frameworks, fewer surprise disruptions, a reputation for honoring long-term commitments even during market stress. For importers, that matters. Grain buyers are not chasing the lowest price on paper. They are optimizing for outcomes, on-time delivery, manageable financing, reduced political friction, the ability to plan budgets months, sometimes years in advance. As these priorities sharpen, the map of global grain flows is adjusting. In several key markets, procurement patterns reveal a subtle change. Contracts that once defaulted to U.S. suppliers are now split, hedged, or redirected. What began as diversification has, in some cases, become displacement. This is how access is lost not through exclusion, but through redundancy, when buyers no longer need a supplier, leverage disappears. For decades, grain exports gave the U.S. quiet influence. Supply relationships reinforced diplomatic ties. Trade dependence created alignment. Even when political relations cooled, food flows often continued, preserving channels of engagement. But food leverage only exists when buyers lack alternatives. That condition no longer holds. Canada's grain system benefits from proximity to major shipping lanes, streamlined regulatory coordination, and a reputation for insulating agricultural trade from political signaling. For buyers wary of sudden policy shifts, this creates confidence. Confidence becomes contracts. Contracts become infrastructure alignment, and infrastructure locks in new trade realities. Once mills, ports, and storage facilities adapt to a supplier's specifications, switching back becomes costly. This is the irreversible phase, and it happens quietly. In the United States, the implications are already surfacing. Export volumes matter. When a major market reduces intake, surplus builds that affects domestic prices, storage costs, and planting decisions. What looks abstract at the geopolitical level becomes tangible on farms and in rural communities. This is the hidden cost of losing access. Yet the deeper issue is not volume, it is relevance. Global food trade is entering a period where buyers assert more agency. They are no longer passive recipients of surplus. They are architects of supply chains designed around resilience, not tradition. Grain is being folded into broader strategic frameworks: logistics investment, food processing capacity, financing terms, even infrastructure development. Suppliers that understand this are gaining ground. Those that rely on legacy status are slipping. The U.S. agricultural export model was built in an era when scale alone guaranteed access. That era is ending. Markets are fragmenting. Multipolar trade is replacing concentration. Buyers want optionality. Canada has positioned itself accordingly, not as a disruptor, but as a stabilizer, and in today's environment, stability is power. What makes this especially consequential is that food trade realignments are rarely reversed. Once confidence shifts, it doesn't snap back. Trust, once lost, requires time and concessions to rebuild. This is why the current moment matters. The loss of a single market would be manageable. The normalization of exclusion is not. What we are witnessing is the erosion of an assumption that American grain will always be central. The shift is quiet, the data is technical, the consequences are slow until they aren't, because when food flows change, influence follows, and the question now facing U.S. exporters is not whether this market can be reclaimed, but whether the system that once guaranteed access still exists. To understand why this quiet grain shift matters so much, you have to zoom out beyond any single exporter or buyer and look at how food power itself is changing. For most of the modern era, global food trade was built on scale and surplus. The largest producers fed the largest deficits. Influence flowed from abundance. Countries that could grow more than they needed shaped the terms of trade almost by default. That model is breaking down. Today, food security is no longer defined by volume alone. It is defined by control, predictability, and insulation from shock. Importing countries are no longer asking who produces the most grain. They are asking who can guarantee delivery under pressure: financial pressure, political pressure, and logistical pressure. This is where quiet shifts become decisive. Grain markets are particularly sensitive because they sit at the intersection of food, finance, and geopolitics. A shipment of wheat carries with it currency exposure, shipping insurance, regulatory compliance, and timing risk. Any one of those variables can derail supply. In recent years, importing governments watched multiple shocks collide: pandemics, shipping congestion, interest rate spikes, and geopolitical standoffs that disrupted trade routes without warning. These events exposed a hard truth: efficiency without resilience is fragile. As a result, food procurement strategies have fundamentally changed. Rather than maximizing short-term price advantage, buyers are optimizing for continuity. They are building redundancy into supply chains. They are spreading contracts across multiple suppliers. And when forced to choose between slightly higher costs and lower uncertainty, many are choosing certainty. This is not ideological. It is survival logic. Canada's grain positioning aligns with this shift. Its export system emphasizes stability over speed. Its regulatory environment prioritizes consistency. Its trade posture avoids sharp political signaling around food. For buyers seeking insulation from global volatility, that matters. Meanwhile, U.S. grain exports are entangled in broader dynamics that buyers cannot control. Currency volatility tied to dollar-denominated trade directly impacts import budgets. Financial tightening raises insurance and shipping costs. Regulatory changes and political signaling inject uncertainty into long-term planning. None of this makes U.S. grain inferior in quality or quantity. But in a world obsessed with risk mitigation, perception matters as much as reality. Once buyers begin hedging away from a supplier, momentum builds, storage systems adapt, contracts normalize, port infrastructure aligns with new flows. Over time, the alternative becomes the default. This is how markets close without ever announcing themselves closed. The consequences extend far beyond agriculture. When food trade patterns shift, they pull entire ecosystems with them. Shipping companies reallocate routes, insurers reprice risk, banks adjust trade financing exposure. Even diplomatic engagement evolves when economic ties weaken. Grain flows are the circulatory system of global trade, change the flow, and the entire body adjusts. This is why food power has always been geopolitical power even when it operates quietly. For the United States, the loss of preferential access carries compounding effects. Reduced exports soften domestic prices, pressuring farm incomes. Lower margins constrain investment in infrastructure and technology. Over time, competitiveness erodes further. This creates a feedback loop. As export volumes shrink, the ability to offer flexible terms declines. As flexibility declines, buyers look elsewhere, and as buyers leave, scale advantages weaken. Breaking this cycle is difficult not because it's impossible, but because it requires structural adaptation rather than incremental fixes. The question facing traditional exporters is whether they are willing to rethink food trade not as transactional commerce, but as strategic partnership. Many buyers are no longer satisfied with purchasing raw grain alone. They want integrated systems, localized processing, shared storage investment, technology transfer, and financing. Structures that reduce exposure to external shocks. Suppliers who can embed themselves into broader food security strategies gain leverage. Those who deliver only commodities risk becoming interchangeable. Canada's quiet move fits this emerging model. It is not about domination. It is about positioning, and in global trade, positioning often matters more than power. What makes this shift particularly consequential is timing. Global demand for grain is rising, not falling. Population growth, urbanization, and dietary change ensure long-term consumption pressure. This is not a shrinking market, which means exclusion today compounds into absence tomorrow. Once a supplier loses relevance during a period of growth, re-entry becomes exponentially harder. Buyers build systems around whoever shows up reliably when it matters most. This moment, characterized by uncertainty, volatility, and reassessment, is exactly when long-term alignments are formed. That is why the current realignment should be understood as a warning, not a blip. The grain trade is becoming multipolar. Influence is dispersing. Buyers are asserting sovereignty over food systems, and exporters are being judged not only by what they grow, but by how they behave under stress. This is a structural shift, not a cyclical one, and it raises uncomfortable questions. Can traditional exporters adapt to a world where buyers set the terms? Can food be decoupled from financial and political volatility? Can long-standing assumptions about market loyalty survive an era of choice? These questions are not theoretical. They are being answered in real time through contracts, infrastructure investment, and procurement strategies that quietly redraw the map. There are no dramatic headlines announcing the loss of influence, no ceremonies marking the end of access, just spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and new defaults. That is how food power fades, not in collapse but in silence.